All right, today we are joined with a very special guest, Brittany, and she is here to talk to us about BCBA, behavior, lots of different things that we can pick her brain about. Brittany and I had the pleasure of working together in a previous role as behavior specialist, and just kind of our friendship grew from there. Kindred spirits, we always said when we met, like we should have met earlier in life and kind of doing the same teaching at the same time in opposite ends of the cities here. And it really blossomed into some awesome things. But Brittany has furthered her career outside of teaching and is a licensed BCBA now, which is amazing. What dreams are made of right there. And is now living in the beautiful sunny Florida. Even though we miss her very much, I'm very jealous that she's enjoying all the sunshine. I'm going to let her introduce herself a little bit and her background and kind of where she is and what she's doing now, and then we'll dive into some questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Christine, for having me today. It's a pleasure to be on your new adventure with you.
The
So,
new
I'm
adventure.
Bill, and I am a board certified behavior analyst. A little bit about my background: I was a special education teacher for the first 7 or so years in my career, and I mostly worked in high needs special education, like self contained settings. I taught early childhood. I started out in birth to two. I moved to 3 to 5, and then I moved to K to 5. So
To
I
get
really
progressive.
with my students over the years, and it's been so fun just really focusing on the skills that kids need to be successful, like in and outside of the classrooms. So when I was in the classroom, I was super passionate about like data driven decision making, right? So I had all these kiddos with pretty significant needs, a lot of them behavioral, academic, communication needs. And I didn't really have like a true model to follow, right? I knew that I wanted to get these kids out of my classroom and into their general education classroom, but what does that look like, right? How does that work? And we really needed data to make those decisions. So I worked really hard with my kids and my team every year. That was my like professional goal, was to increase the time spent out of the special education classroom and into the general education classroom. And you really have to be intentional about that, right?
100%.
Like we can't just throw these kiddos to the wolves that don't have the skills yet.
Mhm.
So it's all about like teaching the missing skills. If we think about misbehavior is a result of missing skills, just like anything else.
Mhm.
After my time in the classroom, I was super passionate about like spreading this love, right, to schools that and people,
With
teach
love.
may not have any idea what they're doing, kind of how I felt at times. Like, what am I doing here? How do I get, I know that this is my goal, but how do I get there? How do I get these kids ready to be, you
Yeah.
know, in their goals and all of that? So I did some consulting with school districts for a few years and really worked on like program development. What constitutes like a really awesome setting three program? What does our continuum of services look like for these kiddos with behavioral challenges, right?
Mhm.
From our general education population to our self-contained classrooms, there's a lot of in between there too. So what does that look like? How do we move between that continuum and really set kids up for success? So then I decided, after years of living in the teaching world and behavior world, I'm like, I want to take this a step further. So I decided to go back, and I went back to school for like the 100th time, it felt like. But I completed my board certified behavior analyst coursework. I did my 2000 supervision hours, which I've got two young kids at home now. But in the thick of it, 2000 hours is a lot of hours.
It's a lot of hours.
Sweet. Um, but I am now a BCBA. I work with school districts kind of all across the country, and I'm really just passionate still about the same work that I had been doing, but just in a different lens, like really pinpointing not just the behaviors of students, but the behaviors of staff as well. Like, how can we set our staff up for success and really like teach them the missing skills
Uh-huh.
alongside?
Yeah, a lot of times they're missing it. I love that you brought up the point about those center-based programs and the continuum of service because I think that's such a hot topic right now. I know for sure in Minnesota, as our center-based numbers are on the rise, I feel like that's kind of nationwide just with the COVID epidemic that happened and all these kids staying home and the technology and all these pieces. But I've noticed this huge trend in a larger number of kids getting placed into these center-based programs, and how are we working diligently to get them out? Because I think we get them in, right? Because they need the services, they need all these extra things. But then when it comes to getting them out, what are we doing, right? Like, what are we doing to get them into the classroom, or what are we doing to collect that data and to really provide the best instruction we can so they can be successful, which I think is where a lot of times now districts are turning to BCBAs because we really struggle. And I can say that from my own, when I was in the classroom struggling with data collection and trying to figure that out as a baby teacher, like, what? You want me to do this? Um, and how those BCBAs are really being integrated into our districts more. Because I think that when I think of BCBA, I think of back in the day when I was doing my ABA under a BCBA, in college, like doing all of that and doing that in-home therapy. And I think there's two sectors, right? There's the clinical side and there's that side where these kids are going to outside facilities. Like here in Minnesota, we have a couple, or they're getting in-home. Or now we're bringing that into our districts and that model looks different. So my question for you is, what does that model for a BCBA look like in a district? Like, I shouldn't say how, what do you provide to districts, to these classrooms, and what do BCBAs do within our school districts and public schools?
Yeah, that's a great question. And just to even back us up a little bit more, just for the audience here, ABA is applied behavior analysis.
Yes, thank you, Brittany.
It is scientific look at behavior. A lot of times, behavior can feel very personal to people, it can be very subjective. And what ABA does, it really breaks down behavior into like what is observable, what is measurable, and how does the environment play into the behaviors to either the positive or negative behaviors that we're seeing or decrease those negative behaviors. And it really has to do with all of the variables, right? And we as educators, administrators, paraprofessionals, those are really big variables that can make a big impact on student behavior. So, as a BCBA in a school role, really what that looks like is looking at the programs that are there. Typical ABA, you're looking at just individual
Yeah,
people, right?
right.
And there is some of that, absolutely, when we're talking about writing behavior plans based off of functional behavior analysis, like at the individual level. But then we've also got these programs that we've got to look at, right? Because we've got multiple students in these settings where the environment really does play a really big role in their success. So things like schedules and routines and what visuals are being utilized in the classroom to really kind of set kids up for success. We're looking at, reinforcement systems. That is one of the biggest, hottest topics that I always bring into classrooms. Like, what are you using for your reinforcement system? And I think a lot of education over the years has gotten, in a way, we've shifted, right? We'll go away from reinforcement systems because I think the old school ideology is like, why do we need to? A lot of times people think of reinforcement as bribery, which they're very, but kids just need to do what they need to do because we're asking them to do it.
Yep.
And it does not work for the kids that we're with, right? We
Right.
solid things in place so that they feel motivated, so that that behavior can really change effectively. And I think about reinforcement systems, like getting that set up for a whole classroom, from tier one, like when we're talking about general education classrooms, all the way up to that tier three, in our model, like we need to have really great reinforcement systems in place all across the board. Like a lot of our schools are PBIS schools.
Yep.
That's great, but as a BCBA, I'm also looking at, the frequency of the reinforcement. A lot of our kids can't wait for a monthly celebration.
Oh.
Sometimes every 20 minutes we need to be providing that access to reinforcement.
Right.
So, those are just a few things.
Yeah.
And the biggest thing when I go into classrooms and into schools is looking at like antecedent interventions.
Mm,
To know what's happening before the behaviors are happening. That's where we have a lot of control as educators is in the environment is just how are we prepping our environment to prevent a lot of these behaviors from happening in the first place, right?
yeah. Let's back that up a little too. So again, like so antecedent for those listening is what happens before the behavior. So a lot of times as behavior specialists or BCBAs, we're looking at that ABC model. So you'll hear that a lot when talking about behavior. So antecedent behavior consequence, what happens before, then the behavior, and then what happens afterwards. And Brittany and I always love to say to people, consequences don't always mean negative. Consequences could be positive, right? It could be a positive reinforcer for the child. You could be reinforcing the child. The consequence could be maybe even something negative, like they lose something or, other things. But just remembering that consequences aren't always negative. Um, I think the biggest piece I just took away from what you said, Brittany, is that BCBAs kind of come in and assess the whole program, right? And really look at the function of that program and how they can help facilitate things better for the classroom as a whole. I think you guys do a lot of individual, right? Like I think sometimes we bring BCBA, excuse me, in to look at individual students. But
Yep.
when thinking big picture for districts, right, it's more like what can you do to help program and get the most success out of these kids by having somebody like a third party.
And I will even say too, we're talking about students, but when I'll have a lot of times staff say to me, this kid needs a behavior plan. This kid needs,
Mhm.
we've got a long list of all these kids that staff have deemed needing to have a behavior plan. And behavior plans are meant to be, they're a very restrictive tool, right?
Yeah,
It's an absolute, very restrictive tool that is not, it's not for the kid necessarily, it's for the adults.
for the adult. I was gonna say it's not the magic. I feel like sometimes people are like, well, let's write a behavior plan. Like that's the magic pill and this fairy dust comes down and everything is solved. But I agree with you. It's for the adults.
The adults. And it's for the adults to have kind of a step-by-step plan of how they are going to change their behavior
Hmm.
impact the student's behavior. And when I say change their behavior, I mean like all those environmental pieces, right? What does their classroom look like? What are the tools that they're using with the students? Are they using those tools with fidelity? All of those things. And if I get called in for individual students, the first thing I'm doing if they do have a behavior plan is looking at that.
Yeah.
Are all these tools being implemented with fidelity? Is staff response consistent across the board? And, we are in a time in education where there's a lot of turnover, right?
Mhm.
We're losing teachers left and right. A lot of times people don't feel like they have the tools to be successful. And that's the really neat role as a BCBA that I like to play is kind of reinforcing the adults,
Yeah.
right? Following those behavior plans for making sure that they are really impacting student behavior in the direction that they want it to go.
Yeah.
Because I'm sorry, I have a little one in the background here.
Okay, this is real life, and this is exactly what I told Brittany before we started. This is exactly what I want is real life because that's what all of us are. We're, working parents in this field, and we're all just trying to do our best, and that's okay if your kids are in the background. Normally, mine are coming home from school like yelling, talking to me.
Happy squeals over here. But we really do have to, I think, from the administrative level down to like our paraprofessionals, like we have to be giving positive reinforcement to our teachers, making sure that we are giving them the tools to set them up for success. Because I mean, there's a lot of turnover with our paras, with our teachers. And I think when people don't feel supported, when they don't feel like they have the tools in their toolbox, that's how we lose people.
Yeah.
So Yeah, like that's one of my favorite things is, in ABA we call it pairing, just like building that relationship with a child. But there's
Yeah.
also that needs to happen with the adults to really kind of trust and, have everyone on the same team and understand that, when somebody as an outsider does come into someone's classroom, it's a very personal kind of intimate place to be, right? So just making sure that all stakeholders really feel supported and there's no judgment zone,
Right.
all there for the kids, right?
100%. So the other cool thing that Brittany does is she does Fed Setting 3, which is Federal Setting 3 or center-based program audits, where she comes in and trains staff and looks at, your programming as a whole, which is really cool because I think you have such an amazing brain for that because you see that data side of things and you have that BCBA lens that you can look at. And then you can also have that personal piece too of really getting in with the staff and understanding their day to day. And I think that we need more of that because there is so much coming out, like I said previously, with all these programs popping up that we are just playing whack-a-mole and we no longer have what I feel like maybe you and I had way back in the day, where like these roadmaps almost, or, we had more time to tailor our programs because they were few and far between, right? Like kids being placed in center-based programs, I mean, even 5, 6 years ago looked very different than it does now. So I think there's a lot that can be said around that too. And I want to ask you, what are some things when you first walk into a program that you really like to take inventory of? Like, what are those most important pieces when you're thinking, I need to audit this program? These are the things I'm going to look for.
Yeah, so I'm so sorry about that, the little squealing in the background.
Oh,
But the number one thing I'm looking for when I walk into a room is the schedule, right? The schedule and the routines and the consistency. I think consistency is key. I'm looking for those reinforcement systems that are, again, being implemented consistently.
yeah.
Um, for the relationships between staff and students, what does that look like? Is it positive? Has that pairing, like I had talked about before, happened effectively? And then just looking at student engagement, like what does that look like? Is it a high level of student engagement? Not so much. And then just like how are we individualizing the supports in that room? Are things is it a one size fit all model, or are things really individualized?
Yeah,
So
I think that's a really great. I like that you said the schedule piece of it because I feel like we all forget that, right? Because we're just getting so busy and like, well, this kid needs to go here and this needs to go here and we have to do this and now I have to do this. And I think that we often forget because I walk into programs too and I'm like, there is no schedule. There's nothing here. So if I don't know what's going on, how does the student know what's going on and how is there any predictability? And I think I want to back up further too of how important do you think routines are, right? Like teaching routines and really spending a lot of your time around those routines.
yeah, I think the routines are everything. The first 6 weeks of school, a lot of research says like that is when we are
Hmm.
really building those routines in the classroom and teaching them. But the routines, we need to have a routine for everything in the class. How we turn in our work, how we ask for help, how we
Hmm.
move from one part of the room to the next, how we line up. I mean, there needs to be a routine for everything, because kids, they thrive on predictability, and when there's routines, we have predictability. We understand a little bit more of like what the consequences will be, of following that routine or not following the routine.
Yeah.
And for teachers too, it just makes everyone's job so much easier when there's a routine that's really solid. And a lot of times what happens when we see a lot of spikes in student behavior, right? Mid-year, February is a great time right
Yeah.
now to talk about that.
Totally.
And it's cold and the kids aren't going outside as much, especially in Minnesota. um, we have to go back and revisit those routines and reteach the routines and
Yeah.
just assume that they know them. I hear a lot of times teachers say it's February or March and we've been doing this all year. How do you not know?
How do you not know this?
But they, if they're not doing it, then They don't.
Mhm.
Like we have to revisit it, and it's worth
Yeah.
the time to take
I think
away.
that goes back to what you said in the beginning, and I wanted to bring this back up was teaching those kids those missing skills. So those behaviors that you're seeing are kids, exhibiting that because they're missing that skill that maybe hasn't been taught or just isn't sticking with them. And so how do you combat that with staff coming in as that BCBA or that behavior person? Um, to really talk through with them about those missing skills and how to reteach them and what that kind of looks like, excuse me. Do you have a good way of doing that?
Go back to like if we're talking about specific, let's just say self-contained classrooms, right? If we're talking about wanting to integrate kids into that general education classroom setting more, like what
Hmm.
does general education classroom look like? What are those expectations there, right? Do they have to sit in the carpet? Do they have to stay in their chair? I think those are some of those missing skills that like I think bringing it back to that for staff can be really helpful of like, okay, there is, we've got reading, we've got math, we've got all these other things that we need to teach, but until behavior is really addressed,
Yeah.
anything. So self-regulation has to come before education does. And
So glad you said that. I feel like that's something we say all the time because everybody's like, I have to teach the core and I have to get these academics in. And I feel like I'm constantly saying, you will get nothing done if you don't get this handled first.
yeah, and I think it overall we're coming around to that idea a little bit more in the field of special education anyways. Administration's understanding a little bit more like the importance of why some of these classrooms look very different. But I do think we really have to target like identify exactly what the skill that is missing,
Hmm.
and we have to learn about it, and we have to embed it all day into our reinforcement systems and our schedules and routines and all of that.
Right.
I think the buy-in comes from seeing it work, right?
Hmm.
Does work, and I think that's really reinforcing for the adults when okay, let's take the first 15 minutes of the day, just review all those expectations, really practice. Maybe we're practicing lining up, we're practicing sitting in a chair all the time, or we're practicing X, Y, and Z. I think when they see, I think seeing it kind of come to fruition and in real
Yeah.
time, that's people are more likely to do a more of it when they see positive results.
Yeah. Let's go back to data collection really quickly because I think that's a big piece of your position, right? And I think it's something that we obviously are push for a lot within, special education within the public school system is we're collecting that data. Going back to our previous episode talking about ESY needing that data to qualify these kids. And how do you get those teachers set up for success with these data collection systems? Is there something you can offer to them to like where you would start small or, just some suggestions around like how to start collecting data?
I think the first part is like making sure if you're working with students that have a behavior intervention plan, aligning their behavior goals on that behavior intervention plan to their IEP goals is a great step,
Yep.
right? I think using tools like check in, check out, where it's more of a sorry, we've got dogs now in the background.
Real life. I love it.
Check-in checkout system, and like kind of a point sheet model. Not it doesn't even necessarily have to be directly with the student, but once we identify what those target behaviors are that we're tracking, we need to be tracking them all throughout the day so we can start seeing patterns of where are we struggling, where are we like doing okay, right? Because when we talk about making data driven decisions, what I like to look at in a more restrictive setting is does this kid demonstrate success, over a course of time with math, right? Is let's say we're getting like 90% of that data moving in the right direction during math class. Hey, maybe that might be a great time to start integrating math into their schedule in the general education setting, right?
Yeah.
I think, as far as data goes, we have to be, I'm so sorry. We have to just make sure that we're measuring the things that we need to be measuring, want to be measuring, and not, like we want to make sure we're measuring the most important things.
Yes. Right. Definitely. And do you think a lot of times they can just build that off of, say, like a point sheet, right? You can get data collection from point sheets. Those are always a great option for students. Like Brittany was saying, those check-in and check-out data points are really good for students. Any others that you can think of that might be good?
Yeah, I think having tools readily available to teachers is really important too. Like if we're measuring the student's ability to use like a coping skill, I see that a lot of times in behavior plans. And
Yes,
like, how are we measuring that? So I think just using a clipboard or something like that's easily accessible so that in the moment you're able to just do like check yes or check no. Having that data sheet set up ahead of time for all of your students, where you're able to make a simple, check yes, this happened or it did not
right.
happen. I think that can be a really great way to just make sure that we are collecting the data. It's not something that's being forgotten about and it's just right there at your fingertips.
Yeah, I think another important piece too is for people to understand that you can use your paraprofessionals for this too, right? Your paraprofessionals can be collecting that data. They can be doing those pieces for you, like having the clipboard or following the student to class and taking that observational data. But I think it also goes back to, like Brittany said before, really empowering the staff that you work with and really training them so that they feel equipped to do a lot of these things too. Because I think what happens in a lot of classrooms I've seen, and we've all gotten there, is, the teacher gets used to doing everything and the paras are just kind of helping, which I think there's nothing wrong with, but I think there's something to be said about empowering the staff to all be working together and that paraprofessional is also a teacher, right? And that the students are seeing that para as a teacher as well. Because then when you're gone or you need them to do something for you, it's easily, facilitated. But again, comes back to like empowering them to take that data, empowering them to feel confident to do that. Because I think sometimes they're like, I don't know, and I haven't been trained. And I think what a lot of times Brittany says in a lot of her trainings that I love is just really working with that staff and spending some good quality time and having a para handbook and having para meetings and having para conversations that are ongoing and monthly to really talk about those things with your staff so that your program can run smoothly. Because they're honestly the biggest, I don't think it's the students that can devastate a program, it's staff, right? It's staff not cohesively working together. It's staff that are inconsistent, and one staff is saying one thing and one staff is saying another. And not everyone is on the same page. And that, let me tell you, every behavior student out there will find that person and then they will be their new best friend. Um, but I mean, and when I was running my program, I would have to say, and I think Brittany can say this too, the most successful times I had in my program were when I had my consistent staff that we all just worked together so well and smoothly. And we had those monthly meetings and we had those constant conversations, and there was no little loopholes that students could find. I mean, sometimes you would have those, but I think building your staff's capacity is the first key to successful programming. I mean, Brittany, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think again, we have to set people up for success, right? We don't put our least trained
Right.
people highest needs kids, which that does happen all the time. But in programs, we have to look at who are our strongest players here, right? Who is going to really feel confident and competent in
Hmm.
delivering that are necessary for these kiddos. And so I think it's really important in the hiring process and all of that, making sure we are devoting time for that specific training, especially to our paraprofessionals. Absolutely. And I think just before we go here, one other thing I'd like to just mention, the topic of ABA can be a little controversial.
It sure can.
That in the autistic community, there's been a lot of talk over the years, like people anti-ABA and people that are really for ABA. And I think, for people that are not familiar, we want to make sure that we are like being being affirmative to some of those neurodivergent
Yes.
kiddos too, right? Like some of the stimming and like when we talk about behaviors that we want to change and we want to, change for more acceptable and appropriate. We want to look at things that are really related to like safety and access to education. We want to let our kids be themselves as well. And I
Yes.
that that is just, you know, part of the growth that's happening in the ABA community too is
Mhm.
really that, right? Making sure that we're targeting the right things um, for behavior change, and that we are being very affirmative to our autistic individuals and being trauma informed in our delivery of services as well. All things that are
I think that's great. I'm going to shamelessly plug Brittany here before we end today. Brittany offers, like I said at the beginning, a variety of behavior trainings for districts throughout here in Minnesota, especially. She might live in Florida, but I can tell you she will be here even on the coldest days. When Brittany was here, when we trained together, I swear it was like the coldest day in Minnesota possible. And she was here and we were training and we were up early and it was beautiful. But she offers some wonderful trainings that around the trauma-informed approach to behavior, um, just around behavior and programming in general, around center-based programming, self-contained classrooms, whether that's an ASD classroom, autism spectrum disorder, a DCD, a developmental cognitive delay, or an EBD program, right? Emotional behavioral disorder. There is a lot that can be applied to all of those programs just in one conversation. I think sometimes we get stuck in this mindset of, well, this is this program and this is this one and this is this. And really that model can work for all of them in some sort of capacity. And I think Brittany does a wonderful job of really presenting to staff and helping them understand that. Brittany also owns her own behavior consulting company, Synergy Behavior Solutions, and offers a variety of different things for people for that. Brittany, if you want to jump in, you can. If not, I'll shamelessly plug you. I don't mind as you rock that baby. I love it. So if you are interested in any of these, I'm going to link Brittany's website and Brittany's information with this episode so that you can reach out to her. If you're in need of any behavior training or solutions for your school districts, I highly recommend Brittany for that job. She is a wealth of knowledge and a wonderful speaker in front of crowds, which I am not. I was just laughing with her about that. That this I don't mind, which is weird, but when we stand in front of a large group of people, I'm the one who's like sweating and nervous, and Brittany's cool as a cucumber and just beautifully presenting. And I feel like staff just really, really love you, and you just do a beautiful job. So. I really appreciate you joining today, even with those babies. That's okay because that's real life and I just love seeing them. So show us that baby first of all.
she's a little she's not very happy with me right now, but I'll show you.
Oh, she was happy a little bit ago. She is not happy.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful. And yeah, we'll have my website linked below, and I look forward to connecting with you guys further.
Yes, thank you. Bye.